May 1946, Camp Alva, Oklahoma. The repatriation truck sat idling in the morning dust, their engines coughing diesel smoke into air that tasted like freedom for everyone but her. 24-year-old Greta Weber stood at the back of the line, watching 300 German prisoners climb aboard with their cardboard suitcases and Red Cross parcels, heading back to a homeland that no longer existed. Heading back to rubble and starvation and the judgment of a shattered nation. She'd prepared for this moment her entire captivity. Rehearsed the words in her mirror made of polished tin, practiced the defiance in her voice. But when Sergeant Miller called her name and gestured toward the truck, Greta's mouth opened and the wrong words fell out. "I'm not going." 3 simple words, 3 words that would make her a traitor to some, a coward to others, and something she couldn't yet name to herself. The sergeant blinked. Around them, the compound fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Ma'am," he said slowly, carefully, like he was talking to someone perched on a ledge. "Germany's your home." Greta looked at the trucks, at the faces pressed against the canvas, pale and gaunt even after 2 years of American rations. At the country that had taught her Jews were vermin, that had put a rifle in her brother's hands at 15, that had promised her glory and delivered only ash. Then she looked at the mess hall behind her, where she'd learned to make apple pie. At the library, where she'd read books that had been banned since she was a child. At the small garden plot where tomatoes grew fat and red in soil that had never known artillery fire. "No," she whispered, "it's not." But before we dive into how one woman's choice became a scandal that reached the highest levels of military command, hit that subscribe button if you're ready for stories that history tried to erase. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because these forgotten truths deserve to travel far. Greta Weber had never meant to become a prisoner of war. Then again, nobody ever does. October 1944. Aachen, Germany. The first German city to fall to the Americans, and Greta had been there when it happened, not as a soldier, not as a believer, but as a 22-year-old clerk in a Wehrmacht supply depot who'd been too slow to evacuate and too terrified to know which way to run. The bombing had lasted 3 days. When the silence finally came, it felt obscene, like the world had forgotten how to make sound. She'd emerged from the basement of a collapsed bakery with 9 other women, all of them covered in white dust that made them look like ghosts. Fitting, she thought. They were ghosts. Ghosts of a Germany that propaganda had promised would last 1,000 years and hadn't even made it to 12. The American soldier who found them was younger than her brother had been when he died at Stalingrad, baby-faced and freckled, with eyes that went wide when he saw them. "Nicht schießen," Greta had whispered, hands raised. "Don't shoot." He'd lowered his rifle, offered her a canteen of water. That was the first betrayal of everything she'd been taught. The transport to America had taken 6 weeks by ship. Greta spent most of it vomiting into a bucket, too seasick to be afraid. The other women whispered prayers and predictions. The Americans would work them to death in mines, force them into brothels, experiment on them like the stories they'd heard about the camps. The camps they'd been told were just rumors, lies spread by enemies of the Reich. Greta had stopped praying years ago, right around the time her mother's ration card stopped being enough to buy bread. When they finally disembarked in Virginia, the first thing that struck her wasn't the guards or the fences or the strange flat landscape. It was the smell. Fresh-cut grass, gasoline, something baking that smelled like cinnamon. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was burning. The woman next to her, Liesel, gripped Greta's arm hard enough to bruise. "It's a trick," she hissed. "They're fattening us up." But when they arrived at Camp Alva 3 days later, after a train ride through endless Oklahoma plains, Greta began to suspect that if this was a trick, it was the most elaborate one in human history. The barracks had real beds. Thin mattresses, yes. Scratchy wool blankets, yes, but beds. With sheets, white sheets that smelled like soap. Greta sat on the edge of hers and wept. She didn't know why she was crying. didn't know if it was relief or shame or the simple animal response to softness after months of sleeping on stone. Liesl sat beside her, silent, and together they stared at their hands in the dim light filtering through the barracks window. Hands that had once been smooth, hands that had typed requisition forms for boots that never came, for rations that were stolen, for a war machine that had been cannibalizing itself since Stalingrad. Now those hands were blistered and calloused, nails broken, skin cracked from cold and hunger and the alkaline dust of Aachen's ruins. "They'll take the beds away tomorrow," Liesl said finally. "Once they see we're not afraid anymore." But they didn't. The first meal arrived at 1700 hours. Greta knew it was 1700 hours because the Americans ran everything on military time, same as the Wehrmacht. It was one of the few familiar things in a world that had become suddenly, violently strange. The mess hall was a long wooden structure that smelled like bacon grease and coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory mud they'd been drinking in Germany since 1942. Greta stood in line with her tin tray, watching the American cook, a heavy-set woman with flour in her hair and sweat stains under her arms, dollop food onto each prisoner's plate. Mashed potatoes, green beans swimming in butter, a thick slice of meatloaf that glistened with fat, a bread roll, white bread, soft, still warm. Greta's tray trembled in her hands. Liesl was ahead of her in line. When the cook handed her the plate, Liesl stared at it like it was a bomb. "What is this?" "Dinner," the cook said in accented German. She had a kind face, Greta noticed, crow's feet around her eyes. The kind of face that smiled often. "There's meat?" Liesl whispered. "Yes, ma'am." "Meatloaf. Camp regulations say POWs get the same rations as American troops. Geneva Convention." Greta's legs went weak. She made it to a table and sat down before they could give out entirely. Around her, 300 German women stared at their plates in silence. Nobody ate. Nobody moved. Then Hildegard, a former nurse from Munich who'd seen men die from infected paper cuts because there was no penicillin, picked up her fork. Her hand was shaking so badly the fork rattled against the metal tray. She cut a piece of meatloaf, raised it to her lips, paused. "It's not poisoned," someone said. Everyone turned. At the far end of the hall, Captain Morrison sat at a separate table with 3 other officers. He was eating from an identical tray. Same meatloaf, same portions. He looked up, met Hildegard's eyes, and took another deliberate bite. "Geneva Convention," he repeated in slow, careful German. "Same food, same portions. That's the law." Hildegard ate the meatloaf. Greta watched her face as she chewed, watched the way her eyes closed, watched something that looked like grief flood across her features, pulling her mouth into shapes that could have been a smile or could have been a sob. When Hildegard swallowed, she whispered 4 words that would haunt Greta for the rest of her life. "It tastes like before the war, before the rations." Before the day Hildegard had held a dying 17-year-old boy's hand while he bled out from shrapnel wounds, whispering for his mother because there was no morphine left and no bandages and no God listening. Greta picked up her own fork. The meatloaf was dense and savory, rich with something she couldn't identify, an herb maybe, or a spice. The potatoes were creamy, impossibly smooth, like her grandmother used to make when Greta was small and the world still made sense. She ate until her stomach cramped, until she had to put her fork down and breathe through the nausea of fullness, a sensation so foreign it felt like illness. That night, lying in her bed with its white sheets and scratchy blanket, Greta stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile 2 impossible truths. The Americans were the enemy. The Americans had just fed her better than Germany had fed her in 3 years. "Somewhere in the darkness," Liesl whispered, "this is how they break you. With kindness. It's worse than cruelty." Greta didn't answer, couldn't answer, because she was terrified that Liesl was right. The camp library opened on Tuesdays and Thursdays, from 1400 to 1700 hours. Greta discovered this during her 2nd week, when she was assigned to work detail in the administrative building mopping floors, emptying wastebaskets, filing papers she couldn't read because her English was still fractured and uncertain. She'd been passing the library door when she saw them. Books. Hundreds of books. Thousands, maybe. Lining wooden shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their spines a rainbow of colors she'd almost forgotten existed. In Germany, they'd been burning books since 1933, literature deemed un-German, Jewish authors, communist authors, authors who asked the wrong questions or imagined the wrong futures. Greta's hands were still gripping the mop handle, knuckles white, when Corporal Jenkins found her standing there. "You read English?" he asked. "Some," Greta lied. Her English was terrible. Scattered phrases picked up from guards and work assignments, nothing close to fluency. Jenkins smiled. He had a gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than he probably was. "Well, you're welcome to browse. All POWs got library privileges." Geneva Convention. There was that phrase again. Geneva Convention. Like a magic spell that transformed prisoners into people. Greta returned to the library on Thursday. She chose a book at random, something with a blue cover and gold lettering, sat in one of the wooden chairs by the window where late afternoon light fell in dusty columns, opened it. The book was All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. Banned in Germany since Hitler came to power, burned in public squares while crowds cheered. Greta had heard of it, of course. Everyone had. The book so dangerous the Reich couldn't allow its own citizens to read it. A story about German soldiers in the First War, written by a German veteran, deemed too pacifist, too defeatist, too truthful. She read the first page, then the second. By the third, her hands were shaking. By the 10th, she was crying. The words on the page described men, German men, patriots, believers, marching off to war with flowers in their rifles and songs on their lips. Described how war had stripped them of everything that made them human, how they'd died in mud and gas and pointless charges ordered by officers who never set foot in the trenches. It was her brother's story, every word of it. Hans had been 15 when he was conscripted into the Volkssturm in the final desperate months. 15, and they'd given him a rifle with 3 bullets and told him to hold a bridge outside Berlin. They'd sent his personal effects home in a wooden box 4 months later, a watch that had stopped at 03:15, a photograph of their mother, a letter he'd started writing but never finished. The last line, in Hans's careful schoolboy script, "I don't think we're going to win." Greta had burned that letter, burned it in the kitchen stove while her mother wept, because possessing it was treason and treason meant execution, and they'd already lost enough. But here, in an enemy prison camp in Oklahoma, she was holding a book that said everything Hans had been killed for thinking. Corporal Jenkins stopped by her table near closing time. "You okay, ma'am?" Greta looked up at him. This young American soldier with his gap-toothed smile and his clean uniform and his easy kindness. This boy who would have killed her brother without hesitation if ordered to, who probably had killed someone's brother. "Why?" she asked slowly, searching for the English words. "Why do you let us read this?" Jenkins looked puzzled. "It's a good book. Important book. Helps folks understand what war does to people. In Germany, they burned it." "Yeah," Jenkins said softly. "I know. That's why it's important you can read it here." He left her alone with the book. Greta sat there until the sun set and the library grew dark and a guard had to gently escort her back to the barracks. She carried the book with her, clutching it against her chest like a talisman. That night, she read it by flashlight under her blanket. And somewhere between page 80 and page 85, between descriptions of rats in the trenches and the terrible lottery of survival, Greta Weber felt something inside her break clean in half. Not her spirit, not her will, her certainty, everything she'd been taught, everything she'd believed, every promise the Reich had made about glory and destiny and the righteousness of their cause. It had been a lie, all of it, and she'd known. Some part of her had always known. But knowing and admitting are different countries, separated by an ocean of fear. Liesel found her crying at 200 hours. "What's wrong?" Liesel whispered, climbing into Greta's bunk. Greta couldn't speak, could only press the book into Liesel's hands and watch her friend's face as she read the title. Liesel's expression went through a dozen transformations: shock, disbelief, curiosity, and finally, devastatingly, recognition. "They let you read this?" Liesel breathed. Greta nodded. "They let us read this." Another nod. Liesel was quiet for a long time. Then, "What else have they been lying about?" It was the most dangerous question in the world. It was also the only question that mattered. The letter arrived in March 1945. Greta almost didn't recognize her mother's handwriting. The script was shaky, inconsistent, words crowding against each other like refugees fleeing a burning city. She sat on her bunk and read it 3 times before the words made sense. "Dearest Greta," it began. Standard, expected. Then, "Berlin has fallen. The Russians came through first. I won't tell you what they did. I can't. Your cousin Margot is dead. Your aunt is dead. The house on Lindenstrasse burned. I am staying with the Hoffmans in their cellar. There is no food. The ration cards are worthless. People are eating grass." The letter went on for 2 pages, each sentence worse than the last, a catalogue of horrors delivered in her mother's increasingly erratic hand. It ended, "When you come home, there will be nothing to come home to. But you must come home. You are all I have left." Greta folded the letter carefully, put it in the small wooden box under her bed where she kept her few possessions. Then she walked to the latrine and vomited until she was empty. That afternoon, during her shift in the camp kitchen, she burned 3 potatoes. Mrs. Kowalski, the head cook, found her standing over the ruined pot, staring at the blackened lumps. "You got bad news, honey?" Greta nodded. Speech felt impossible. Mrs. Kowalski, this 60-year-old Polish immigrant who'd lost her own family to the same war that was now eating Germany alive, put a hand on Greta's shoulder. "Sit down. I'll make you tea." "I burned the potatoes," Greta whispered. "Potatoes can be replaced. You can't. Sit." The tea was hot and sweet and tasted like pity. Greta drank it anyway. "Your family?" Mrs. Kowalski asked gently. "My mother. She's alive. Everything else is." Greta trailed off. There wasn't a word big enough. Mrs. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know what's waiting for you in Germany?" "Home," Greta said automatically. "Rubble," Mrs. Kowalski corrected, not unkindly, just factually. "Starvation. Men who blame women for losing the war they started. You know what they're doing to German women who fraternized with occupying soldiers?" Greta knew. Everyone knew. Shaved heads, public beatings, worse. "You know what's waiting for you here?" Mrs. Kowalski continued. "Prison," Greta said. Mrs. Kowalski laughed. Actually laughed. "Honey, you think this is prison? You get 3 meals a day, a bed, library access, work that pays wages. There are American citizens who don't have that much." It was true. Greta had been saving her earnings 15 cents a day for kitchen work. She had almost $60 now, more money than she'd ever possessed in her life. "When the war ends," Mrs. Kowalski said slowly, "there's going to be programs, ways for POWs to stay if they want, if they've been good, if they've got skills America needs." Greta looked up sharply. "That's possible?" "Nothing's certain, but I've heard talk. Captain Morrison's been writing letters to Washington, arguing that sending skilled workers back to a destroyed country is wasteful, that some POWs might choose to immigrate properly." The word hung in the air between them. Immigrate, choose, stay. "I can't leave my mother," Greta said. Mrs. Kowalski squeezed her hand. "You can't save her either. Not from an ocean away in a country that's eating itself. But you can save yourself." That night, Greta lay awake and tried to imagine it. Staying, becoming American, learning the language properly, maybe working in a real restaurant someday, not just a camp kitchen, maybe having a life that didn't taste like ash. But every time she closed her eyes, She saw her mother's face, saw Hans's funeral, saw the small apartment in Aachen where she'd grown up, probably rubble now, probably home to rats and ghosts. How do you abandon a sinking ship when your family is still on board? How do you save yourself when survival feels like betrayal? May 8, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. The Americans celebrated with a bonfire and music piped through speakers set up in the compound yard. Someone had a fiddle. Someone else had moonshine they weren't supposed to have. The guards danced with each other, whooping and hollering, while the German prisoners watched from the barracks windows. Greta didn't watch. She sat on her bunk with the letter from her mother pressed against her chest and tried to feel something. Relief, maybe. Joy. The war was over. The dying could stop. But all she felt was numb. The war was over, and Germany had lost, which she'd known for months, maybe years, which everyone had known, really, once the tide turned at Stalingrad and the Allied bombs started falling day and night. But knowing and accepting are different countries. Liesl sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Liesl said, "My brother was SS." Greta turned to look at her. In 2 years of captivity, Liesl had never mentioned family. He believed it all. Liesl continued. Her voice was flat, empty. The racial purity, the Lebensraum, the destiny of the Reich. He volunteered, 16 years old, and he volunteered. Where is he now? Dead. Probably. Maybe. I don't know. He was at Buchenwald when it was liberated. The Americans found. They found what was there. Greta's throat closed. They'd all heard the reports by now. Seen the photographs the Americans made them look at during what Captain Morrison called re-education sessions. The camps, the gas chambers, the bodies stacked like firewood. The guards had been German, the orders had been German, the efficiency had been German. Greta had vomited the first time she saw the photographs. Then she'd gone back to her barracks and torn apart her bunk looking for anything with a swastika on it. Found an old armband she'd forgotten she had from her brief stint in the Bund Deutscher Mädel when she was 13. Burned it in the latrine sink until there was nothing left but ash. "I can't go back to that," Liesl whispered. "To a country that did that. To people who did that. Even if I never participated, even if I never knew the full extent, I can't. I can't breathe air that's been poisoned that badly." "But it's home," Greta said weakly. "Home is wherever you can live with yourself. And I can't live with myself there." Outside, the music got louder. Someone was singing in a thick Oklahoma drawl, something about sweethearts and homecoming. "Are you going to try to stay?" Greta asked. Liesl nodded. Morrison said there might be a way, if we work hard, if we learn English properly, if we prove we're not a threat. It's a long shot, but... She trailed off. What's the alternative? The alternative was written in Greta's mother's shaking handwriting. Starvation, rubble. The judgment of a nation looking for someone to blame. Greta closed her eyes and tried to pray for the first time in years. But she didn't know what to pray for. For her mother's safety? For permission to abandon her? For forgiveness for wanting to live? God didn't answer. But somewhere between the music outside and Liesl's quiet breathing and the scratch of her mother's letter against her ribs, Greta made a decision. Not a good decision. Not a noble one. A survival decision. The kind of decision people make when all the choices are bad and you just have to pick which bad you can live with. Captain Morrison's office smelled like coffee and paper and the leather of his worn briefcase. Greta sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to shake. Beside her, Liesl was white-knuckled but steady. "You understand what you're asking for," Morrison said. "Not a question. A statement." "Yes, sir," Greta said in careful English. She'd been studying, 4 hours a day in the library with a dictionary and a grammar book and stubborn determination. Morrison leaned back in his chair. He was older than most of the guards, maybe 50, with gray in his hair and eyes that had seen too much. You'd be applying for immigration status under a special provision for POWs who've demonstrated rehabilitation and skills useful to the American workforce. Rehabilitation, as if they were criminals recovering from crime rather than survivors of a war they'd never wanted to fight. But Greta swallowed the bitterness and nodded. The process takes months, Morrison continued. Maybe years. You'd have to stay in the camp during processing. You'd need sponsors, American citizens willing to vouch for you. You'd need employment lined up. And even then, there's no guarantee. We understand, Liesl said. There will be people who hate this, Morrison said bluntly. Americans who lost sons and husbands to German bullets. They'll say you don't deserve to be here. They'll say you're taking jobs from citizens. They'll call you worse things than that. They'd be right, Greta said quietly. We don't deserve it. But we're asking anyway. Morrison studied her for a long moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out 2 forms. Set them on the desk between them. Fill these out. I'll forward them to Washington. Mrs. Kowalski has agreed to sponsor you both if you're approved. She's got restaurant connections in Oklahoma City. Says she can get you jobs as line cooks if you're willing to work hard. Greta's hands were shaking as she picked up the pen. The form was in English. Dense, bureaucratic English, full of words she had to look up in her dictionary. Terms like alien resident and oath of allegiance and renunciation of former citizenship. That last one stopped her cold. Renunciation of former citizenship. She would have to formally, legally, permanently reject Germany, reject her birthplace, become something other than German. Could she do that? Did? How she have any choice? Greta thought about her mother's letter, thought about Hans dying at 15 in a uniform that was too big for him, thought about the photographs from Buchenwald that still woke her up screaming, thought about the library full of books she'd been forbidden to read, the meals she'd been fed, the small kindnesses from people who were supposed to be monsters. She signed her name, Greta Weber. For now. Someday, maybe, it would be Greta something else. Greta Morrison, maybe, if she took her sponsor's name like some immigrants did. Or Greta Smith, Greta Jones. Something American, something clean, something that didn't taste like ash. The months between application and approval felt like living in purgatory. The war in the Pacific ended in August. The camp celebrated again, but this time, Greta joined them, stood in the compound yard and watched fireworks explode against the Oklahoma sky in bursts of red and white and blue. She was allowed to work outside the camp now, part of a program for POWs awaiting immigration decisions. 8 hours a day at a farm 10 miles outside Alva, picking tomatoes and beans alongside Mexican migrant workers who spoke a Spanish-English hybrid she couldn't follow but gradually began to understand. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, paid her 40 cents an hour, handed her the cash at the end of each week with a nod and no questions. She saved every penny. By October, she had $300 hidden in a sock under her mattress, more money than her mother had seen in 5 years. She tried to send some home, but the postal service to Germany was chaos. Letters went unanswered. Packages disappeared. Greta didn't know if her mother was alive or dead, fed or starving, safe or suffering. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. In November, Liesl got her answer first. Application denied. No explanation. Just a form letter in bureaucratic English that might as well have been a death sentence. Liesl took it to her bunk and didn't come out for 2 days. When she finally emerged, her eyes were hollow but her voice was steady. "You'll get approved," she told Greta. "You're younger, better English. Mrs. Kowalski likes you more." "That's not true." "It is, and it's fine. One of us should get to stay." "What will you do?" Liesl shrugged. "Go back. Find whatever's left. Probably starve. Probably end up like every other German woman trying to survive in the rubble." Her smile was bitter. "Maybe I'll get lucky and find an American officer who wants a housekeeper. Or unlucky and find a Russian soldier who wants something else." Greta wanted to argue, to promise it would be okay. But they'd both seen the reports. They both knew what was waiting in Germany. "I'm sorry," Greta whispered. "Don't be. Just make it worth it. Make staying worth it." In December, Greta's answer came. Application approved. Conditional status granted, pending final interview and sponsorship confirmation. She was going to stay. She was going to live. She was going to betray everything and everyone she'd ever known, and she was going to do it anyway because survival is the most honest choice there is. That night, she wrote a letter to her mother. She wrote it in German, in the language of her childhood, and she tried to explain the unexplainable, tried to find words for choosing life over loyalty, for picking herself when she'd been taught to always pick the collective. The letter was 7 pages long. She never sent it. Instead, she burned it in the latrine sink and watched the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, carrying away words she could never say out loud. "I'm sorry. I love you. I'm not coming home." May 1946. The repatriation trucks idling in the compound yard. Greta stood at the back of the line, with her approved immigration papers in a manila envelope and her $300 in her pocket and her entire future balanced on a knife's edge. The other prisoners filed past her, 300 women, heading back to a country that no longer existed. Some of them glared, some of them looked envious, most of them just looked tired. Liesel was near the front of the line. When she reached Greta, she stopped, set down her cardboard suitcase, pulled Greta into a hug so tight it hurt. "Make it count," Liesel whispered against her ear. "Make everything count." Then she was gone, climbing aboard the truck with the others, and Greta was alone on the American side of the fence. Sergeant Miller approached her with a clipboard. "Miss Weber, you're cleared to proceed to Oklahoma City. Mrs. Kowalski's arranged housing. Job starts Monday. You'll need to report to Immigration Services monthly until your permanent status is confirmed." Greta nodded. Couldn't speak. She watched the trucks pull away, watched them disappear into the Oklahoma dust, watched 300 ghosts of the life she might have lived vanish into the distance. Captain Morrison materialized beside her. "You made the right choice." "Did I?" "Yes." "How do you know?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you're standing here asking the question instead of lying in rubble waiting to die. That's how." He handed her a train ticket. Oklahoma City. One way. Greta looked at it. At the English words printed in neat black ink, at the date and time and destination that would carry her irrevocably forward into a future she'd stolen from the ashes of the past. "I'm a traitor," she said. "You're a survivor," Morrison corrected. "There's a difference." "What if there isn't?" "Then you'll spend the rest of your life figuring out which one matters more." The train left at 1100 hours. Greta was on it. She pressed her face against the window and watched Camp Alva disappear behind her, watched Oklahoma flatten into endless plains, watched the sun climb higher in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Somewhere ahead was Oklahoma City. A restaurant kitchen, a rented room, a language she was still learning, a life she had no right to. Somewhere behind was Germany, her mother, her brother's grave, the ruins of everything she'd ever known. She couldn't reconcile the two, couldn't make them fit together into something that made sense. So she stopped trying. Instead, she pulled out the English dictionary she'd been carrying in her bag and opened it to a random page. Started memorizing words: reconcile, to restore friendly relations, to make compatible. Traitor, one who betrays another's trust or is false to an obligation or duty. Survive, to remain alive or in existence, to carry on despite hardships. The definitions blurred together. Greta closed the book and closed her eyes and tried to imagine the person she might become in this new country with its new language and its impossible, unearned mercy. Someone who made apple pie. Someone who sent money to Europe when the postal service finally stabilized. Someone who never forgot but learned to live anyway. Someone who chose the third option when loyalty and death were the only ones on offer. The train rolled on. America opened its arms. And Greta Weber, traitor, survivor, thief of second chances, stepped forward into the light. If this story moved you, subscribe to Lost Voices of War. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because these are the stories history tried to bury, and together we're digging them back up. These were real people, making impossible choices in impossible times, and their voices deserve to be heard.